All right. Happy Thursday, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. We have a really awesome duo of speakers today, and we cannot wait to get this show on the road and ask them a couple of questions. But first, my name is Andrew Whipp, and I'm the lead creative and editor at Green Buzz Agency. I'm also joined by my longtime friend and colleague, Todd Plotkin, the CEO and founder of Green Buzz Agency. Todd, how you doing, man? I know you're a big sports fan. You excited to have baseball back?
I am very excited for baseball to be back. I have not been following the Boston Red Sox anywhere close to I did as a kid growing up in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, but I am learning about all the players on the team, their batting average. I'm back in. I can't wait for tomorrow and to have some live sports back.
Yeah, it'll be nice. I've been pretty desperate on my end, looking for sports. I even started watching MotoGP lately, which I didn't even really know existed. So I'm right there with you. I'm ready for it. But as a quick aside, if any of our audience members somehow ended up here and don't know who we are, what we do, Green Buzz Agency is a full-service production company, and we're based out of Old Town Alexandria, and we specialize in documentary, motion graphics, and branded content. So if you or your teams are curious about the process of making a video or are looking to tell your own story, don't hesitate to reach out. But bringing it back around, today's webinar is the 8th in our Green Buzz Agency webinar series, which we created to connect our community, you guys, with thought leaders who can help us break down top-line strategy, best practices, and advice during these really tough times. Today, we'll be covering a topic of understanding the new consumer, the 5 post-isolation personas and shifts in media consumption. So if you're looking to stay on top of media trends and bring some new ideas back to your teams, then you are definitely in the right place. So that leads me to our panelists. We have Dan Ho, who is the president at Huge Southeast. Dan has played an instrumental role in growing Huge over the past 10 years and has transformed the user experience for clients ranging from Target and Four Seasons to USA Today and the PGA. Dan's passion for content marketing and addictive consumer experiences has made him a successful CEO of several startups and co-author of a book used at Wharton. Andrew Bleeker is the president and founder of Bully Pulpit. He is our second panelist. Andrew served as the lead digital marketing strategist for both of President Obama's campaigns, as well as senior advisor to Secretary Clinton. Since Bully Pulpit's inception in 2009, Andrew's expanded to 4 offices and managed a $1 billion marketing budget. Thank you both for sharing your time today, your wisdom, and your experiences with us. We are super excited to kick this off. So with all that out of the way, let's jump into the good stuff. Andrew, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks for having me. I hope everyone is wide awake. We're also looking forward to sports and many other things, but I think that's sort of a good transition to today, which is, where are we, right? We know the world has been dramatically impacted over the last couple of months. It's hard to keep up from crisis to crisis to crisis. And I think what we all wanted to do today, Dan and I in particular, is just take a step back and try to look at, from a marketing perspective and from a brand perspective, where we are and where the audiences are. So I'm going to start a little bit more macro, and then Dan's going to go into some specific research on audiences themselves. So how has the world changed? We think from our perspective, and we do a lot of research, as probably everyone on this Zoom does, on consumers, on voters, on decision makers, on regulators, on investors, all sorts of different groups. And there are three main vehicles through which we've changed. The first is that the world has changed itself, right? And I think we're going to look at socioeconomic impacts and cultural impacts of how quickly we're changing. The second is we've changed, right? And this is really where, well, I'll touch on it, but Dan's going to go a little bit deeper in terms of how we get our information, our content, what we expect out of people and out of brands. And then a little look forward to where we're going, and also realizing that as much as it feels like things have changed a lot in the first half of 2020, we're just barely into the second half. Actually, we have some pretty big things coming up for the second half of the year, most notably a pretty important election that I think everyone is going to be impacted by. So great. So let's just jump in. So where are we? What has happened this year? Let's just take stock, right? We sit here in July. It feels like it's been, on one hand, I'm still stuck in March. I barely left this chair in the last few months. On the other hand, it feels like we've been in this year for a really long time, right? Obviously, it started with the pandemic. Really out of the blue, things that happened recently in politics that we didn't remember. We had an impeachment. just around the corner, right? We were really just at economic highs as we started the beginning of the year. Then we had obviously the recession, and now we're seeing a dramatic schism between a fair recovery in the stock market, driven by major economic stimulus, and a hugely different story in the real economy, with double-digit unemployment likely to be the case for a long time. In the social justice space, we'll get into this probably in terms of the most detail today, but major changes, particularly in certain communities that actually overlap quite a bit with those hardest hit by the pandemic and the recession, most notably communities of color. And then, at the same time, as much as we can barely keep up with it here at home, things overseas are falling apart pretty quickly, right? And so whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's the very few countries that we're allowed to still travel to, our place in the world has shifted dramatically. And why does all this matter? It matters because it shakes the very core of who Americans are, how they perceive themselves, our self-confidence, and our belief fundamentally in the American dream, which was essentially that if you are able to get an education and play by the rules, you've got at least a chance of doing as well or better than your parents did. And that is not where most Americans, particularly younger Americans, see themselves today, and that is a real tipping point in terms of how we think about reaching consumers. Let's look at a couple examples. The other thing that's changed, right, beyond just the world seeming like it's collapsing every day, murder hornets or whatever it is that we all are here in front of screens. I used to travel probably 3 or 4 days a week for the last decade. Again, I barely left my house. The ups and downs of that are I am on screens all day, every day. I have a 2.5-year-old, so I don't know how some people have time to watch this much television. I seem to have none. I hope more of you have time than I do. But the streaming growth is really, really phenomenal. I think we're seeing this all over, that obviously there are winners and losers in this. As we are joking about sports, but it's actually a pretty phenomenal problem for television, particularly linear television, right, which is the black line in these charts. In terms of where the increases, everything's up because people are sitting at home, right? So all media use is up, but in particular, linear is seeing a much less of a growth because what are they watching? What are people watching? Most fall TV shows were not able to finish production. There's been no live sports. We're going to see if it sticks around when it comes back. What has grown is news, and more news. Number one, and then number two, on-demand content. Right, on-demand content that's bingeable or even old content, right? And things like Disney Plus are benefiting dramatically from this, but also audio, right? So looking at podcasts and certain types of content really benefited from commutes, particularly in urban environments, right? Obviously, we're seeing things like drive time radio way down, right, with a much smaller number of people commuting in the same sense. And for those who've had to travel recently, rush hour is a very different phenomenon at the moment. But on the other hand, we have a lot more time on our hands on the whole. So there is an opportunity here, right? People are scared, our worlds are changing, and people are plugged in, right? So there's clearly a market opportunity. And the question is, how do we best position ourselves for it? The other thing that is, as we think about this, it's just good to put a little bit of this in historical perspective. One of the best examples, I think, is how quickly is change happening. And I certainly remember this day very vividly when gay marriage was upheld in the Supreme Court, and the Obama White House lit itself up as a rainbow. But that was a long time in the making. But actually, in the scheme of social movements, it was radically fast, right? So look at U.S. support for same-sex marriage, right? And really, for those who remember, really the 15-year period almost, right, from 2004 back, and I worked on the Kerry campaign in 2004 when President Bush used this as a wedge issue to mobilize conservatives. And fast forward to where we are today, 2016 and the Supreme Court decision. That is major change on a societal issue. One of the and at the time, it was really the fastest we had ever seen something this substantial move in terms of public opinion shift. And all sense of time and scope has changed. And then we look at the last 2 years, and particularly the last 3 months on Black Lives Matter, and many different ways of looking at this all get to the same point, right? The support of Black Lives Matter as a movement and how deeply misunderstood it was, I think, for years, is very evident here. But it's true if you look at any number of certain polling questions, right? Views on Black, economic equity, overall views of racism in this country, or how important these issues are. We've never seen social movements move this quickly. It's amazing, it's uplifting, and it is shaking the foundations of how quickly we are used to moving, right? And so it is necessary, it is overdue, but it is earth-shattering, right, for much of the country, and just not on any particular issue, but the pace at which social change is happening feels like everything is moving under our feet all at once, right? And I think this is just a really good illustration of it. And that's something we all need to keep in mind when we think about how do we want to actually connect with consumers and marketing. So let's look a little about how brands are starting to think about that. The other challenge we have, as we do, is when things seem like they are shifting, when the ground feels like it is shifting under our feet, where do we turn, right? And it's a totally fair question. And in times past, and I don't mean the Stone Ages, but in recent memory, and we've seen this from bowling alone over the last couple decades, right, and all the academic research that has gone on to support it, that Americans' connections to institutions that are an all-time low. Whether that's religious institutions, churches, synagogues, mosques, whether it's volunteering organizations, civic organizations, everything from the Lions Club or VFW or whatever it might be, we have far fewer organizations that we're actually connected to, right? So that I think is piece one. And so what are the ones that we are left still connected to, right? And it's really interesting because the biggest one, and for many, many Americans, particularly younger Americans, the only institution at all that they have any direct connection with is their employer. And so in these times of social change, we look to our employers for very different things than we've looked to our employers to in the past, right? We look at them to help put in context what's going on. We look at them to speak out, right? And be good citizens, corporate citizens, which is something we can talk about in terms of purpose, right? Which is dramatically shifting business, right? In a way that we had not looked at on the whole, employers and large employers in that space in the past. We also look at it as a place for our own activism. And as we are all fired up, as we're seeing these horrific images, the murder of George Floyd, right? And we're looking to get active. One of the very few places in which we have to push is our own employer, right? And so we'll see this on issue after issue. And it's a major change in terms of why brands are reacting the way they are, where the new power centers are, and frankly, the power of employee advocacy, both offensively and defensively as we move forward. And then the only other ones beyond the employer are things like like we see this in Washington here, and just today, like the Washington football team, but cultural institutions, right? We don't have a formal connection to them in the way we might have had with the church, but that's the other kind of place we see activism going. So, and that could be a brand. When we've seen tons of these, whether it was, and again, some fueled by correct information or misinformation, depending on your point of view, but whether it's, what we've seen in the fight between Lowe's and Home Depot, what we've seen in terms of brands boycotting Facebook, but obviously the connection between the institutional connection between consumers and brands is one of the few other places they can put their energy and enthusiasm. So clearly we need to change, right? Brands need to change. They know the pressure's coming. It's coming not just from without, it's coming from real folks tied to our business. It's tied to, whether it's advertisers in a Facebook connection, and then most importantly, from what we've seen across our clients, it's coming from within. And when you add to that the massive fight for talent that is unabated even in this economy, everyone is still trying to find those same engineers, those same creative voices, those same leaders. And so the risk of losing within and the risk to companies when they start to lose their own employee base is so dramatic that we've seen some really impressive commitments and some commitments that are now that may have seemed impressive a couple of years ago that are now really being challenged as insufficient to meet the moment. And that's the question for brands. Okay, so let's just look at one or two and then we'll look ahead. One that has gotten probably more notoriety than anything else in the last couple of weeks is Pepsi. And PepsiCo, which as everyone knows, is far more than a soda brand, right? So obviously they took in retiring a brand, one of the most well-known and forward-looking steps on actually removing a racist brand, right? They also committed over $400 million to Black enterprise over the next 5 years. And the question that everyone is going to start to get is, what else can we do beyond writing checks, right? I think Pepsi is one that is further down the road than most on this, and they have a lot going on. And I think it will be interesting, but that's going to be the bar. That's going to be the bar from their own people. that's going to be the bar from investors, regulators, consumers, and everything else down the line. And again, most brands have not come anywhere near to commitments like that. One other one that, where I think we're really seeing fascinating growth is some of the folks that feel very essential, and I use that term intentionally, to how we all get through this crisis. And one of them is Instacart, which has really seen dramatic growth as it's been a mechanism to help all sorts of folks, right, who might be elderly, might have pre-existing conditions, all sorts of things to actually get food in the midst of this crisis. And I think there's going to be extra pressure on brands like this that are seen as relatively benefiting from the crises. And I think Instacart's done a really amazing job. I would point you to the Feeding America partnership, where it's now part of every potential transaction. There are long-term partnerships between and real opportunities for brands to partner with philanthropies, causes, and try to do things that feel like way more than writing checks, but feel like real tangible impact. Right. And so this is certainly going to be one as the gig economy continues. And then lastly, I think the question is looking ahead. So where are we? We are. I come out of politics, as was noted, and we're looking ahead to what, from my perspective as a Democrat, should be an exciting but also pretty terrifying election. Right? I really can't imagine. I think we say this every time, but it really feels totally true. I really can't imagine a more consequential election for the future of this country and actually the future of the world, in terms of certainly the world order. So we're about 100 days now out from the election. 100 days ago, the world looked very different. So I don't want to make predictions. I think we should remember that, just how different the world looked 100 days ago. But looking ahead, a couple things are true. One, obviously, from a poll perspective, you see Joe Biden up almost double digits in popular vote and ahead in a lot of meaningful states today. We'll see what that encourages the president to do, as he tries to hang on to power, or he just fired his campaign manager, is shaking things up. But what it's forcing a lot of brands to do is look ahead and say, what would a Biden administration look like? Right? And many of them, because they've been living crisis to crisis, are frankly behind, right, in really understanding this, on really making sure that they have really looked at where could their priorities in a Biden administration align. How do they build those bridges? And how do they, frankly, get out ahead of what could happen? So a couple of things. One, where we are is very different than where we were in 2008 going into an Obama administration. There is no reason to assume that, I think the assumption is that a Biden victory is a return to some kind of normalcy, or a return to the Obama administration. And that is, if you listen to President Obama and Vice President Biden speak, that is objectively false. A potential Biden administration is talking about meeting the moment in a much more aggressive, progressive, substantive, FDR-like change, right? To try to meet the moment and how much is going to be necessary for this recovery, right? And potentially inheriting double-digit unemployment. Every state, including the federal government, every community, every city is going to be broke. The local deficits are massive, right? And so getting out of this is not going to be a small or short challenge. And it is also a sort of generational challenge, an opportunity to potentially reset the American dream, as I mentioned at the top, and generally speaking, people's belief in whether we have an economy that's built for everybody. So it's something I think most brands are dramatically ill prepared for. And if Biden is able to win, and if the Democrats are able to win the Senate, which is at least a possibility in a way that it might not have been so obvious a few months ago, there's potential for major change to happen, and for regulations, for infrastructure, for priorities to be shaped over the next few years that will impact the next few decades. And so the next fight is what's first, right? So which of the few things that a potential administration could do are really going to happen? So I think different brands are trying to lay out their views in that space. And then the real question people are asking today is, whose side are you on, right? Are you on the side of me and the little guy and the normal guy, or are you on your own side? And that's really, I think, what marketing in this era is about, right? In this moment, which is, are you trying to help me? Are you going to help me through this, or are you trying to use me in some kind of way? And the cynicism is high. The cynicism is warranted. And there are many, many examples of brands meeting this moment, and that will establish them in trust for a long time. And I think there are a lot of very established brands that if they wait to tell their story and miss this moment, will likely never recover. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense. I'm going to turn it over to Dan to walk through a little bit more practically probably than my piece. Where are consumers today? And they've done some really great research over at Huge.
Thanks for that, Andrew. I think this actually it's a bit more tactical in that it's specific about COVID and the pandemic and consumer response to it, but I definitely think it echoes a similar trend that Andrew we've talked about, which is, brand relationships are one of the few institutions that current consumers have to ascribe the values that they believe in. And I do think kind of response to behaviors to the pandemic echoes some of that. It is partially more functional and tactical, but there are some values wrapped up in it as well. So let's get into it. I think this kind of goes without saying, but I just wanted to set this as a baseline that we're all kind of overwhelmed with coronavirus news, whether it's at a national level, whether it's at a local level. Every day there's some case count, if it's going down, if it's going up, what local authorities are doing in response. There's no question that we know what is happening broadly with cases and even consumer behavior. I think what's missing now, and especially if you are a marketer or in some way, shape, or form responsible for a brand, is that it's hard to understand why some of these things are happening. Why are consumers behaving the way that they are? Why do some people behave in certain ways and others don't? And then what is the role of your brand and your brand experience like within that? And how do you need to adjust accordingly? So that's something that at Huge, we really wanted to dig into. This is a very brief plug for Huge, but just so you understand, the whole premise of Huge is that amazing things happen to your business and brand when you put the user first. We're a digital agency, and Andrew, when you were talking through how fast societal change is shifting, whether it's shifting opinions on same-sex marriage or support for Black Lives Matter, what's interesting is we've seen similar trend lines on the adoption of technology, and so I think there's a general sense that I'm picking up that just change is happening at a more rapid pace. And what we found very successful is if you understand the user deeply, what motivates them and why they're behaving in certain ways, the context around that user can shift and you're prepared to adapt accordingly, because at the end of the day, that's who you're serving. So being a user-centric organization, we went really, really deep on user research. So this research happened mid to late April, and so take that with some context. What we first did was we leaned very, very heavily into qualitative research. We had one-on-one conversations with a representative group from across the country, a series of video interviews that we did with them. Next, we did a quantitative view where we surveyed 1,500 people between Canada and the United States to get a sense of what their behaviors are and to check that this is happening at scale. And then finally, we cross-referenced our primary research with secondary research from a Global Web Indexes, is a panel-based tool that covers 18 million consumers across the world, just to make sure that we weren't just seeing sample bias or what have you. So what I'm about to walk you through is kind of the results of that research. And where we landed and how we decided to characterize the outcome of this research is in personas. For those of you who have more of a user experience background, personas are a very common tool for helping design teams and marketing teams wrap their heads around user mindsets. The one thing that I want to clarify, because sometimes they're misunderstood, is that these are mental models that individuals will hold, and they can change over time. So it's not like a demographic shift where if you're a 38-year-old male, that's who you are, and that's not changing. I guess it could if you shift identities, but you generally get what I'm saying. Whereas mental models, there could be events that happen to you or your family that causes you to shift from one of these to the other, or you see new information. So these are not necessarily hard and fast. They're just ways of viewing the world. And I'm going to go into each one of these fives in detail. But first, irrespective of the personas, there were some broad themes that we emerged that kind of cut across all of them, right? That this kind of goes without saying, but media consumption habits, which media channels that people paid attention to, very directly informed their views and which one of those personas they fell into. It did have kind of a political overtone to it, no question, because that's how our media channels are now set up. So that's definitely a factor to consider what media channels you're your target consumers or your audiences are working through. Financial insecurity was another facet that cut across everybody. Everybody, no matter your socioeconomic status, was feeling some degree of insecurity. And that was, you'll see an undertone in everything that we're about to talk about. And then finally, trust, eroding trust in public institutions, but then also uncertain trust in brands. Because this is kind of a new environment, everybody's trying to determine how they personally are going to behave. And a lot of consumers were looking to brands that kind of echoed their worldview, and therefore they felt like they could trust to handle their business responsibly during the pandemic. So let's go into it. The first persona, we're calling them Bandaid Rippers. So these individuals want everything to stay open. They don't want to shut down. They put a very, very high value on personal freedoms, and generally react quite negatively to any kind of preventative measures that they feel like is infringing on their freedoms. Whether that's wearing masks, whether that's having to sit at certain distances, what have you, like this persona generally responds more negatively to any of those types of restrictions. Now, the reasons why they have that behavior could be for any number of different reasons, right? So it may be because within their local communities or even within their social circles, they've seen very minimal personal evidence and impact, so therefore their risk assessment is far lower. But there also could be other factors that override any sort of health concerns that they may have, such as financial insecurity, or that their livelihoods require them to operate in close confines with other individuals or what have you. And if you're already exposed out of necessity through your livelihood, then what is the incremental risk elsewhere is not nearly as significant. So I think it's, sometimes it's this persona is misunderstood, and there's this assumption that they don't understand the numbers or they don't understand the risk. That we found it to not be true, but their interpretation is dramatically different because what they're weighting and what they're weighting the risks against differ quite dramatically from the other personas. At the time, this was again going back to late April, the percentage of the US population, this persona accounted for roughly 15% or about 27 million. I hesitated to put these numbers even down in this presentation because I want to really reinforce that this is directional, right? These are personas, they're mental models. Like I said before, they're subject to change and they can shift. But just to give you some rough sense of what percentage of the population, this is directionally correct. And here's a user quote from one of the people that we spoke to that falls into the category of Bandaid Rippers. This is Elena from Michigan. There's so many people that die from all sorts of things all the time, and there isn't this extreme response. It seems crazy. I still don't personally know anybody that has it. Local response was minimal in the beginning. Now they're trying to make up for it by making it too strict. Some of the latest restrictions just seem ridiculous. So this was one quote that we had. We just felt kind of embodied this mentality pretty clearly. The second persona we're calling trapped butterflies. What's interesting about these people is they tend to be very extroverted and very social by nature. So for them, the separation from their friends and loved ones, or just broader public life is very, very mentally taxing because they derive energy from being social and kind of mixing it up in public places. So if you think about the constant balance of risk to reward that this group is making, this group will listen to a shelter-in-place order and they will follow any legal restrictions that have been put into place. But in the absence of any of that, they're going to be out in the public because they value that social engagement in public life so much. So of course they are willing to comply with any restrictions, right? If it means they can continue to be social and continue to go out and eat at restaurants or what have you. And ultimately, they're looking from reassurances from brands that it's okay for them to be out engaging with the world and being social, because they know that's deep down what they desire, and they're really, really hungry to stay out and about. And because they have more intrinsic motivation to operate as normally as possible, they are likely to be the ones to report back to others who may be more risk averse, like within their social network, what it's like to be out and engaging in various activities, and therefore can serve as kind of word of mouth brand advocates. This group is roughly another 15%, about 33 million is what we're estimating. And just to give you a flavor of how this group thinks, this was Richard from Ohio. We all can't stay locked in our house for the rest of our lives. Life is going to go on. You're going to have to make adjustments. In 1918, which was when the Spanish flu was going around, I'm sure they were saying similar things. This is just a hill we have to go through. I'm not going to be afraid of life. I'll go out in it, but I'll be extremely cautious. I've lived overseas during large disease outbreaks, and there are ways of operating smartly that I'll adhere to. So that's the trapped butterfly. We got that from Social Butterflies. The third persona we're calling polite optimists. So they also are interested in going out, but they want to know that it's safe before they kind of start really re-engaging. This group is really starting to watch case numbers quite closely. If you think about trapped butterflies, they're more following what the orders are, what the restrictions are. Are we phase 1 or phase 2? If we're in that phase, that's how I'm going to operate. Whereas this group is studying the case numbers themselves and making their own decisions. So they're a bit lagging behind the trapped butterflies, and that they'll wait a couple of weeks for the trapped butterflies to go out there and engage in whatever activity there is before they put themselves at risk. However, for them, they're still making this trade-off and this risk assessment of, are there certain activities that I value so much that I'm still gonna go and incur any risk and engage in. So this notion of passion areas emerges. Maybe you're really into sports or outdoors activities or whatever it may be. They will sometimes make exceptions for the particular passion areas that they have. They're also the ones who have picked up a lot of digital habits, learning to operate through video conferencing or what have you, or using Netflix as a proxy for going to the movie theaters. And some of those newly acquired habits will probably stick. And then finally, they want to know that businesses and brands are following the guidelines and are very highly likely to engage in things like Instacart or contactless commerce. This population is roughly 24% of the US audience, about 50 million people that we saw. And here's a couple of individuals in Texas and California. I'm ready, I'm excited. Not really nervous because if something does happen, we'll find out because I won't be the first phase to go. Or Harold said, if I go to a wine bar and it's packed, I'm turning the car around. We need to ease back in, not having everybody going out the first Friday and having a big blowout and ending up right where we are. So you can kind of see that real-time decision-making and comfort level that polite optimists are making. The fourth persona that we have is eggshell walkers. These are, I think the one word to associate with eggshell walkers is anxious. They're very reluctant to return to public life and be out shopping and what have you. They're quite risk averse. And there's a number of reasons for this. It could just be their mental worldview, but it could also be possible that they have, household members who are at much higher risk of COVID. Maybe they're aging, maybe there's people who are immunocompromised, what have you. So the health concern is the overriding factor for this mindset. We saw that a lot of individuals were going to wait at least 4 weeks to see, a downward trend in case counts before they started to emerge. And again, this group is similar to the polite optimists. They're very data driven. They're going to want to make their own judgments based off of case counts locally. And they have the highest expectations of local businesses to do what they need to do to limit the spread of the vaccine. And they're also the most likely to engage with brands through proxy. This may be an aging parent who is asking somebody else to pick up groceries on their behalf, just as an example, to minimize exposure and risk. And if we look at this audience size, this is actually, back in April, was the largest audience size. I don't know if this is shifted or not, but this is 38% at 76 million. And just to wrap this mentality up, here's Tamara from Savannah. My household isn't having any of it because we can bring something home and kill my mother. Or once they start opening, I think we should stay at home 3 to 4 weeks to see what happens. I don't want to be a part of the trial, no thanks. I'd rather sit down and watch. There is a fifth persona that we actually didn't expect to find. And we're calling this persona fulfilled homebodies. This group is generally more introverted. And for them, it's not even about just being cautious about whether or not, they're going to kind of reemerge. They're not even really fixated on it. They're not counting it down. They're not even paying that close attention because they're finding life at home so fulfilling. that's kind of, they're comfortable with that being a new normal almost indefinitely. So whether that's because they just get fulfillment out of solitary time with themselves, or their immediate family, or because they're just more introverted and they enjoy like individual hobbies, they're totally okay with it. And it's not to say that this group is not social. We saw evidence of this group still being social, but it's more that the digital socially distant versions of social engagement were enough to satisfy their needs, whether that's Zoom calls with friends, or, you know, whether that's defined as outdoor, you know, socially distanced barbecues, whatever the compromises that they've had to make in order to scratch that social itch, they're comfortable with the trade-offs indefinitely. And for this group, they're really going to appreciate brands that kind of pivot and that create ways to engage with those brands while at home. And more than any other persona, right, because they're spending so much time at home, they will appreciate kind of high quality brand interactions through digital channels. This is the smallest group when you look at the segment size, roughly 8%, or 20 million. But again, we were very surprised to see this. And this is a perfect example, the Charles in Texas, of a fulfilled homebody. This has shown us that we don't really need to go to movie theaters or restaurants anymore. It hasn't been a big deal to not have those in our lives, and for the past few months, we only occasionally went to movies before. Now we probably won't. And it's very easy to see a lot of the habits developed over the last 6 months to continue onward for this audience. So those are the 5 personas and mindsets. I think, you know, having given you the lay of the land, it becomes a question of, well, what does that all mean, and how do we act on it as marketers and keepers of a brand? Well, the first is obviously, you know, how do you keep customers safe? And I just want to be clear that, like, what the mindsets have really made clear is safe is open to interpretation. Each of the personas have different definitions of what it means to be safe. So understanding that and understanding which one of those buckets your customers and your audience falls under is going to be important in terms of how you speak to them, how you prioritize various initiatives. The same applies internally to your employees. They're also fall into these various mindsets. And so internal operational initiatives, I've been involved in a lot of conversations on how to open up offices safely. Like, you have to take these mental models into consideration. And then finally, you know, there is a lot of fear and uncertainty that underpins a lot of these personas. So how do you as a brand make things less scary, even give something for people to look forward to, is going to be a big opportunity for brands to differentiate. I just kind of wanted to wrap up and just leave like a singular quote that I think kind of lays out the stakes for getting this right for different marketers. I'm just wondering how these places will have to change to adapt to the new normal. And will they still be fun and welcoming, or will they be so restricted that you wonder why even bother? If I feel stressed, we're just going to be a family that stays home for coffee and Sunday brunch. So, you know, alleviating the stress, whatever the personas that you're trying to cater to, is going to be important, because you have to overcome this additional barrier for people to engage. That's all I had.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys both so much. I think you both brought up a lot of really fascinating topics that are going to allow us to dive into some discussion here. I just wanted to kick it off with a question for you, Dan, actually. When it comes to, you know, you were talking about how change is happening rapidly on every level. Do you see this change happening on the UX side of things? And is that making your job more difficult, that it's constantly changing because you're never able to find that baseline? You know, is it speeding up so much that you're constantly finding that you guys have to change and adapt, and you can never really find a baseline for how to design a user experience for a brand?
I think the short version is yes, but it is a challenge, but that's also why it's interesting. You know, we wouldn't have jobs if it was easy to do and it didn't change. But I think for me, the good news is it is changing for the better, as we're exploring new interaction models, and it seems like it gets better and better every single time. And it's also interesting when you see shifting digital behaviors cut across new sectors and industries. So, you know, very well documented consumerization of enterprise, for example, right? Like, people got so accustomed to how easy Netflix was, or YouTube, or how easy it is to order from Amazon. They're now expecting that in the work context, procuring new hardware, and communicating with their teammates. So those are good changes in my mind, and we're seeing a lot of people scramble to adapt. And now the latest trend that I'm seeing is that same mentality is applying to healthcare for sure. So the change is hard, but I think it's generally been positive.
Awesome.
Awesome. Cool. This is Todd from Green Buzz. I have a question for you, Andrew, going back to your presentation and kind of very interesting to think about how an organization is so crucial now to their employees and in terms of the sense of community that they have. They have less sense of communities from other institutions. How are organizations doing with that? How are they adjusting? How are they handling being at the center of their employees' sort of social conscious in their social issues that they really care so much about?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Look, I think everybody's struggling with it, right? I think CEOs are struggling with it in a really big way. But a couple of things are clear. One is that the role of the chief communications officer, and in some cases the chief marketing officer, depending on the company, but often they're the same functional person, is really never been more important. Because a lot of, whether you're talking about design, brand, communications, whatever term you want to use for it, there are a lot of companies that believe that these are nice to haves, and I think that's just no longer true, right? And I think that's almost exclusively the case. There's probably almost no one that the CEO is speaking with more right now than their communications team. And what is happening is that internal and external communications are merging into one thing, right? So internal communications is external communications. It needs the same rigor. It needs the same, amount of sort of dedicated time and resourcing, right? So, and in a couple ways. One, the kind of things you might have used to talk to your employees about are benefits of days off and things like that, and that's changed, right? So the topics have changed dramatically. The other is that, the reality is that everything leaks, right? And the expectation is that everything leaks. So whether it's been some that have been perceived, at least in the press, of going relatively well, like how Airbnb handled its layoffs, right, which was sort of lauded as a more human version of having to do it, right, but knowing that piece was going to leak and then having to explain, just basically leaking all the internal communications. And that's now pretty standard, which is that there really is one message internally and externally, and it's the most important stakeholder group. And how are people dealing with it? I mean, it's mostly time. I mean, I think most CEOs that we deal with are now doing at least a weekly, either video town hall or some kind of video for the teams, particularly when they're remote and global. That is really, really rare and new from something compared to 3 months ago. So we're seeing just the amount of time spent on this changing. And then we're seeing, frankly, that advocacy groups are realizing this is powerful too. So, obviously you've seen that targeted to Facebook most probably acutely, but everywhere, which is companies that may feel big and invulnerable, actually extremely, and they're realizing it, and they're vulnerable via their employee base. And so all sorts of groups are realizing that heading into the election.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, there's some questions coming in here on the Q&A function in Zoom, and a couple of them kind of pair up well together. So I'm going to combo two of the questions for you, Dan. One comes from Fran Murphy, who asks, what national brands do you think are getting it right and why? And in combination with that, Bridget Gaddis asked, how do you see all this connecting to real products in brick and mortar environments? So I guess we'll start with, are there any, brick and mortar companies that are kind of doing this well and kind of adjusting to these different personas that are out there? Yes or no, and then what other brands are doing well with it?
That's a great comment. I think transparently, I feel like, at least for the brick and mortar experience, I feel like I've seen local smaller businesses, simply because it's easier to pivot operationally, do better jobs than most. I'm aware of like restaurants in like Seattle, for example, that overnight switch to deliveries and date nights in a box and things like that you would never associate with a restaurant. So it wasn't just a fact that, hey, we're going to make it easier for you to do, pickup, but acknowledging that your entire dating experience might be different, and therefore this new offering is going to resonate for you. And something that might speak to fulfilled homebodies or eggshell walkers or what have you. I do think that some of the bigger, the better national brands, some of the grocery stores in particular stand out for me. Like Trader Joe's, I think was pretty swift to respond. Put in different tactics, like quotas pretty quickly on how many people could be inside, protective barriers for their employees and what have you. It just felt like they were being really, really responsive. I think part of the challenge, just to answer a question that I see that I don't think I see a good answer for, but everybody's going to be faced with, is I don't know how readily you as a brand are going to be able to be all things to all 5 personas. Especially the Bandaid Ripper, what they're expecting out of a brand is quite different than what an eggshell walker is looking for. And what may placate one persona could easily anger and upset another persona. So I suspect what we're going to see play out, and this is pure speculation, is that some brands are going to lean more in one direction or the other. And then depending on which persona you fall into, you'll kind of vote with your wallet. Just like all the other values that we've been talking about that Andrew's been discussing.
Well, and Dan, it's Andrew. Have you looked at partisan, political party connections or political connections, as you think about the different groups? Because it certainly strikes us exactly the same way in terms of political ideology, which is it's very hard when brands are forced to take a side, and we're in at most a 60-40 country, closer to 50-50. It's very hard not to end up on one.
I think it's so hard. And the challenge for brands is that if you don't proactively decide, your customers will just decide for you. Because then you become, you don't ascribe to that value by omission, if that makes sense. When everybody else is speaking about a particular topic and you are not, I think that happens, right? Like, so even if there's no such thing as like not acting, right? Even if, to bring it back to the COVID, if you did nothing, then you're really catering to the Bandaid Ripper. It is how people will assume you're catering to.
Gotcha. I have a question for Andrew from Hank Dearden. He said, will the concept of where does a brand stand on social justice issues migrate to the parallel plane of a habitable planet, i.e., where does a brand stand on climate or environmental issues? What are your thoughts on that, Andrew?
I hope so. I think the parallels that we're all seeing between COVID and climate are striking and scary, right? If we can't mobilize our country, our world to deal with something that is a couple months off, but is very clear, it's a little bit disheartening thinking about how quickly climate's coming around the corner, right? And what needs to happen over the next decade. I think so. And in the middle, though, is I do think we have this opportunity right now to think about, call it black swans, right? Which is that it's both, one of which is obviously, something like climate change. But I think one of the things that brands are being forced to reckon with right now is how short term we are, right? And how dangerous that is. And I think, so much driven by quarterly capitalism and the need to hit earnings. And I think what we're seeing is, well, one, this year kind of gets a write-off and there gets a little asterisk. And one of the things that's allowing people to do, and I think it's realizing, frankly, Wall Street is realizing that they need to let brands focus on longer term a little bit more. And the question is, what else is out there, right? So is it the next pandemic? Is it climate? Is it cyber? Is it geopolitical issues, right? What are those next big major disruptions or changes that we've just been a little bit blind to, maybe short-sighted on in terms of how well things have been going and how predictable the world is, when actually there's some big things out there. And so I don't know if we're going to go right to climate in terms of where brands stand, though I hope we do. But I definitely think we're going to start to see a shift towards short-term focus and longer-term focus. And I think that the types of personas that Dan's describing that are a little more long-term focused, you're also going to see consumers reward brands that are trying to be long-term focused as well.
And just to build off of that, Andrew, I feel like what I'm seeing too is that brand and brand values are really getting stressed and tested right now, and I think are going to have to evolve over time, right? Most brands, and I'll just use a simple car analogy, it's very clear they value one thing or another, right? Volvo stands for safety. BMW stands for, the driving experience. Like those historically are very well understood. Every brand marketer knows they need to focus on that. But because consumers are demanding that brands make a stand on various social injustices, it's putting a greater focus on brand marketers to question, well, what do we stand for? Because it's not possible to stand for every issue out there. It's not possible financially and economically, and there's not enough time and attention. And I think a lot of brand marketers are going to have to ask, and it's going to go all the way up to the top of your organization, what do we stand for? What do we truly care about? What are we going to put our foot and stand on? And what are we going to let slide? Because that's not our place. And I think consumers will be very sensitive to like, well, it's authentic for that brand to stand for that issue. I buy that, versus this brand is just kind of jumping on the bandwagon and taking advantage of a moment.
Cool. And just kind of to transition, you brought something up, Dan, when you were giving the presentation about using the 5 personas and how you've been using it right now to help organizations figure out how to make that key transition from work from home back to the office, how these different personas kind of react to that. I was just curious if you could share some insight into how that's going and what is some strategy there for bringing people back into the office if it's a transitional setup, having people come in. I've heard of some big agencies. I know Edelman in New York is opening their offices back up in August. I've heard of other agencies that have done it, and literally about 4 to 5% of their staff has shown up those first couple of weeks that they kind of make an optional. But just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so like many things, I think some of the trends that we're seeing with clients were already in place prior to the pandemic. COVID is just forcing those initiatives to be far more accelerated, right? So if you look at any kind of retailer, brick and mortar type experience, multi-channel has been something that's been tossed around for at least half a decade, right? Like I can order from my phone, I can order from a website, I can come in physically and order. If you're a quick serve, I can do a drive-through. And fulfillment has also been, do I get it delivered to my home? Is it I order it ahead of time and pick it up on premise, right? Like all of those offerings were slowly being rolled out. It's just now they're mission critical. And so I think, having the brands that have a multitude of ways for consumers to engage and transact are going to be the ones that come out, because they'll successfully let the various personas kind of like opt into whichever version of that they feel most comfortable with, if that makes sense. We work with a massive quick serve brand, and it's exactly this place. Like curbside pickup was an initiative that was in place for the last 2 years. It's just now, well, we have to have it in the market. It's no longer just optional. So that's just one example, but it has lots of ramifications, right? There's like logistical complexity and operational complexity. For if I'm the person who's making the thing, am I making it in advance for somebody? Do they need it right now? Like, do I hand it off to the delivery guy? Do I give it to the server in the restaurant? Like there's definitely like broader implications to it that I think all brands are going to have to figure out. You were asking also about employers, and I think that's transparently something that I was on a conversation about that just yesterday evening. And I think where we're going to land is it's going to have to be similar as well. There's not going to be a single working model. I just think that the personas highlight that a one size fits all is going to be really, really challenging. There's definitely a category of people at Huge who generally trend to more young, more single, stuck in a much smaller place, maybe in the urban center, who is really struggling, to stay at home and to work from home, and they're feeling very socially isolated. And to Andrew's point, your employer was one of the only institutions that you had. That's where your friends are. That's where you got social engagement. So the mental tax on it is very real. So we're looking to see how we can open it up for those segments, whereas there's other segments that have a whole different set of burdens placed on them, whether that's kids at home or elderly parents that they're caring for, that will probably be wanting to work from home for a while.
Cool. And I think we'll wrap this up with this question, and then my co-host Andrew will kind of do the outro for this. But Andrew Bleeker, you had that great slide with kind of what consumption, how it was going with television and some of the streaming giants out there. How do you feel social media consumption has changed, if at all? Is there any sort of spike or difference in terms of people's use of Twitter and all the different platforms that are out there?
Yes, I mean, I think we can certainly send that around as well. But yes, on the whole, we're stuck at home and we're yearning for social connection. So social media is where we turn often when we have nothing else to do. I think there's a real difference though in what we're using them for. So Twitter in particular has become our news source, and it's almost all bad news all the time. And I think social media has just become sort of depressing as a proxy for real news. And normally you used to go to social media to look at, Instagram and see what your friends are doing, or Snapchat or something else, and no one's really doing much, right? And when they are, there's a lot of backlash. So to Dan's models, maybe people post something of their friends at the beach, and half the group that's in a different category is angry at them for being at the beach and maybe not wearing a mask. And so it's just, I think social media is becoming a reflection of how down and polarized the country is right now. And I think it's going to be that way for a little while, but it is going to be, on the whole, something that rebounds dramatically in terms of volume and scale. And it's one of our few outlets, particularly for the group that Dan mentioned, that's stuck in a one-room apartment.
Awesome. Well, really appreciate it, guys. I think that's all the time that we have for today's webinar. To everybody who joined us, thanks for popping in. We hope everyone had fun, learned a couple of things along the way, and then be on the lookout for our next webinar that's going to feature the CMO of Trip Actions, Megan Eisenberg. She'll be talking about making trade-offs in marketing, how to drive revenue while cutting costs, on August 4th. It's going to be another super informative session with tons of takeaways, so we hope to see everybody there. And then finally, an enormous thank you to Dan and Andrew for sharing your time with us today. We are really excited to see everyone next week. Thanks for joining.